Oh, hey there, everybody. Welcome back to our class on relational care. We are starting week 3, which is hard to believe. So we are over halfway in our 4-week course already. And so this week we are going to continue our discussions about the wisdom pattern. We're going to read part 2 of this. And I think, as you know, I really like this book, and particularly in the context of this class. But the part 1 does a great job of setting the table here for part 2. And the part 2, really the main theme of part 2, as we'll talk about here in the next few minutes, is the third way, as Rohr uses that language. And I think it's really good language, and hopefully I'll be able to articulate what that means, at least to me, and perhaps as you reflect on the material, can make sense of it in your own way as well. So, this third way is really still talking about our central theme in this book of suffering. And as we have talked about in the last 2 weeks, is that the overall course here is talking within our initiative on compassion, and you can't talk about compassion unless you talk about suffering. And so we're really still dealing with coming to terms with suffering as being a central theme for, as crazy as it might sound, and backwards as it might sound, for our experience of joy, and what this might mean for us in context of this class, for joy in medicine, and having a real serious in-depth look at what self-care means for me as a physician, as a future physician, and just as a person, right? So we're still focusing on this disorder part of the pattern, and that, I think, is the biggest part of this pattern of order, disorder to reorder. This, though, is this part 2 today in week 3, is moving us, pushing us to a deeper understanding of the disorder. So then we move towards the reorder. And we will read, as you'll see, or maybe you looked ahead, a different book for week 4, which is really a great, I think, cap to this course, and talking about reorder and the third way. I mean, putting it into the context of Rohr's language in the third way. So what this section, or this part 2, starts off about talking about what is our window to reality, and what is our operative view of the world, our operative world view, as the language he likes to use. This is difficult to do, and likely we don't even know, we don't even probably spend the time to think about what our operative worldview is. It's hard to be objective about that, because it is our point of view. It's the way we see from where we're standing, our view from the point we're standing on. And that has a lot of context to it, because it has socioeconomic, it has our personal experiences, and of course, how much money we have grown up with or not, how much education we've gotten or not, how much privilege we've been able to experience and use to our advantage or not. So there's a lot of context there in what our worldview is, and it's hard for us to look past and see, and take a step back and see what that might be in an objective way. But this is what this chapter is about, and it really, this is what motivates us, as he says. And it's one of my colleagues used to say, if you really want to find out where someone's priorities are, you should look at their bank book and their date book. So in other words, your bank book of where you spend your money, and date book as in your calendar of where you spend your time. And that gives us a pretty good idea about what our priorities are and what motivates us. But it's safe to say, I think, for all of us, that as Rohr writes in here in this chapter 7, that our capitalist worldview is where most of us are. This is where most of us see the world through that perspective. And as good it is, in some ways it has a downside to it, because we have a tendency in our capitalistic worldview of, using things of material property as being king, or material possessions. And I don't just mean by bigger house and cars and money and that type of thing, but achievement is certainly paramount for our capitalistic worldview. And that people who don't have that, or maybe don't have as much as others, are often labeled as lazy and irresponsible. We have seen this over and over in healthcare throughout the years, and the best example I like to give to students is the obesity epidemic, and how we have, as healthcare professionals, treated quite literally people who are experiencing obesity, and that we often look at it through this perspective of being lazy and being irresponsible, as in, you're not getting enough exercise. You're supposed to get more exercise, or you're not, eating the right types of foods that you're supposed to be eating, and so forth. And so then, what that has led to is very poor care, and just saying to patients, you really just need to eat better and exercise, and come back in 6 months and see me. And then if that hasn't, if there's no weight loss that has happened, then it's the patient's fault. It's certainly the victim's fault. And in fact, many years ago, it's probably 20 plus years ago, I did a research study on this, and in fact showed that most people are receiving the information that they receive about care for their weight, body weight, is just to a very less than 30-second statement from their provider about, you need to eat better and exercise. And so this became very front and center for me many years ago, also, as it wasn't that long ago, but probably 8-10 years ago or so, where I was working with an individual who, single mother, 3 kids, very low income, no transportation, and had lots of the metabolic syndrome type conditions, and certainly obesity being one of those. And so walking through a day in the life of this person, I got the realization, or perspective, that for her to feed her kids, aside from trying to get to transportation, taking buses to her job, she needs to take the bus to the grocery store, which she lived in a food desert, so that was a minimum of 2 bus stops away. And so trying to say, well, you should eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, and buy this type of food and prepare it in this way, and by the way, get exercise, purposeful exercise too. Not even part of the equation, because can't afford to go to the store and buy food that's more expensive. It has to be food that's going to stay and have some shelf life for a long time. So that process of going to the store to do that is not happening every day, and certainly even every week. So blaming the victim is not something that is part of, hopefully part of the care that we are offering people, such as obesity. So I say that story just as if our worldview is this capitalism worldview, and it's just one example of the type of worldview that we would have, but certainly I think we're all influenced by it, and we can appreciate it if we're passing that on to our patients as far as patient care. That is a reality of our own worldview that we tend to like to emphasize to patients, and certainly not what the patient needs for type of care. So just this is, I guess, a personal example of perhaps putting in the context of this chapter. But I love the quote from Rohr on page 141. It says, "Most people do not see things as they are. We see things as we are." And certainly that applies to healthcare. I know I have done it, and when I'm reading an H&P, and I'm reading, down the profile and I'm thinking about it in the context of my life. Completely unfair, right? This isn't about me. This is about this person that I'm with here in front of me, and we're trying to work through this together. But it seems to be our natural way of doing things, of putting it in the context of my worldview, the point that I am standing on and seeing from my personal experiences and my background, which is not fair to do. So, the other piece to this too is that we seem to, and it's an important part of this chapter on here, is to see things through our own self-image. This is a great segue into week 4, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, and it's in this part 2 from this week also, but talking about our small self versus our bigger true self, and that we almost always, at least through the first part of our life, live in this small self. Everything is about me. The context is me. It's very much an individualism point of view. And it's this attachment to our self-image that is almost always where we see ourselves as separate and perhaps even superior to other people. This has a great connotation for how we connect with people, and this relational exchange that is the central theme, a central theme of this course. And how do we have this relational exchange if we're seeing ourselves as separate and superior? We just cannot make that connection, which then leads to we're not able to provide compassion if this is our self-image, and if we can recognize it, which is the point of this chapter, if we can recognize our worldview, our point of context, and see how we are viewing the world, then we're able to move beyond that and then see the worldview, hopefully, through the eyes of other people, particularly our patients. So, how you see is what you will see is another quote in this chapter by Rohr, also really great. So it's really working on changing how we see the world. So then we move into also another conversation as this part 2 moves on about the great chain of being and connectedness. Really, again, important for our conversation about relationality, about compassion, and that being able to have to understand where we sit in the world, in this great chain of being, and that again, it's a very paradoxical understanding. If we can get ourselves there, that we are whole unto ourselves, but we're only whole when we realize that we are part of something bigger, part of something even more whole. Hard to understand with our rational minds, but if we can move in that direction, then we're moving towards a third way of understanding and of this relationality with others. So much of the suffering that people have, again, this conversation about suffering is really viewed as suffering that is out of our personal control. And oftentimes we view ourselves as the victim. I mean, we almost always do. When we feel bad, we're the victim. We're blaming it on something. We're trying to find a reason for why we feel so badly. And it can't be me. It just can't be me. It's got to be something out there. And so certainly that can be other people where we blame the system. But that suffering is usually we're the victim there. But a wisdom pattern, as we're talking about here, helps us to realize that so much of the problem is not out there, but in fact it's right in here, and that we need to take an interior view and take a serious look at this interior view. And yes, there is certainly a lot of blame to go around, and a lot of blame that is out of our control, that is perhaps structural issues, or there other people, for instance. But it's important for us to take this interior view. And this is hard for us to do because our small self is going to feel wounded, for sure. Our ego is going to feel wounded if we turn and look into ourselves. And we like to protect that at all costs. We don't want to take that interior view, and so oftentimes we don't. But this is the part of this that's important. So yes, suffering is real and it has structural causes, but there's an interior and controllable, I would say. You know, the outside world with its causing suffering certainly feels like it's out of control, but and this is a both and conversation. It's not an either or. This is a both and. But that, you know, an interior view has some controllability to it, and that we can still experience joy even in the midst of our suffering. Even in the midst of our despair, there can still be joy. And this is trying to differentiate the notion between happiness and joy. And a big part of this class is joy in medicine. And things are certainly not always going to go well in anyone's professional or personal life. But that doesn't mean that there still isn't a depth to the feeling of joy that we can experience. Happiness, you know, surface level happiness, which is often mostly talked about, particularly in it's been a hot topic for the last 5 or so years of these you know, courses on happiness and how do I be more happy. And it's really just, or be happier, it's just, you know, kind of a psychological surface level. It doesn't have a great deal of depth dimension to it. But I think if we can read through this material in the second part of the wisdom pattern, hopefully we can realize that there is a depth dimension of joy that we can experience even in the midst of suffering. And it's an important concept. So the great chain of being stays together during this suffering if we both accept what is and work to change it for the better. And we talked about this in the last week. It's a both and. It's an acceptance and an action to change, doing what is ours to do to make life better, to alleviate suffering. But at the same time, there's an acceptance of that the suffering is there and it's part of the life and lived experience. And if we can rest in that tension, if we can sit in that tension that both have, they're just pulling on each other. It doesn't make sense, particularly in our rational mind, that if we can just rest in that, then we can come to some kind of knowing that allows us to be in both at the same time. It allows us to have a foot in both sides at the same time of this knowing that this is part of life, this suffering piece, but also there is something that I can do about it, and being in both places. This is the third way. This is the thing that Rohr's trying to describe here in part 2. This is the third way. It's not projecting our fear and suffering onto other people, and certainly not running from it, not blaming and being the victimized person because of it, which is all works out of our dualistic mind, our binary way of saying it's either this or that, so it's got to be somebody else's fault that I'm suffering. But there's a third way that moves beyond this dualism, that moves into a more expansive and certainly I think a more greater feeling of freedom in that third way. So we are whole, but only when we realize that we are part of something bigger and more whole, and again paradoxical. And this is the third way, and this gets to this, you know, the ending part of this is the great chain of being. If we can realize that we are both whole and part of a bigger whole, then we can get to some kind of, I think, better way of understanding suffering in our world. So, you know, stepping this back and talking about, we can't have a conversation about compassion unless we have a conversation about connection, and that's where we started with this. So connectedness and connection are really important. But we also can't have that conversation about suffering and compassion together. So we can't, I think I said that wrong. We can't have this conversation about compassion unless we talk about suffering. And we can't talk about suffering unless we talk about forgiveness. And that's where Rohr is coming to in this chapter on forgiveness and the power of forgiveness. One of the things I wanted to bring forward in this is our conversation the last couple times we've met this way, last couple weeks of class about an economy of scale that is abundance. And we've talked about this in the context of love. We talked about this in the context of compassion. In that our normal way of looking at it, an economy of scale, certainly from a capitalistic viewpoint, is that there's never enough money and there's never enough time. And so we have to protect and be controllable of both so we don't run out. This isn't the same economy of scale as it is for love, as it is for compassion, and as it is for forgiveness. It's in the same context. Forgiveness doesn't run out. It's not like we can say, well, I'll forgive this, but not that, because I don't want to run out of my ability to forgive. It doesn't work like that. The more you forgive, the more you are able to forgive. It's the same way for love and compassion. So, and this, really works off of trying to understand this relational exchange, and that is certainly rooted in this forgiveness, is that there's something of me that I'm offering out, and then there's an acceptance of that, and then there's a reciprocation of that. And then an acceptance, and this is the dance that goes back and forth, this relationality or relational exchange. Forgiveness is certainly in that part. And I love the way that Rohr explains this as a nonsensical way out. I think there's no better way to say it. It doesn't make sense to our rational mind because we have this deep-seated desire to control. And when I feel like I've been wronged by a person or the system or even myself, that I'm going to hold on to that because there's a sense of control. There's a sense of I'm going to hold this over you, that I have this something that I can hold over the healthcare system or someone who has done me wrong, or even myself, that I'm going to hold on to that out of fear of losing the control. And there's something that needs to be let go of in order to get to this idea of forgiveness. And so for this class, if there's one thing you take away from this class, just one concept would be great that you take away from this class, and that is the letting go. And this is certainly in this piece of forgiveness, that there is this letting go of fear, this letting go of the need to control, and then we can move towards this forgiveness. And in fact, that is one of the primary reasons of doing the contemplative sit as we're doing on a daily basis, or the centering prayer. It's the practicing and re-practicing of letting go. That's the purpose of it. It's not to see how long you can hold your contemplative mind of not having any thoughts come in. It is when the thoughts come in, you just let them go. And it's okay to let them go. It's just a practice and practice and practice. This is one of the central themes for this. So forgiveness is that nonsensical way out, where if you want to feel liberated, and we've all been there before when we've forgiven someone for being wronged, how much better we feel, how much freedom we feel. The lightness returns as opposed to the heaviness. Okay, this is the nonsensical way out. And it's crazy to look at fear. I think there's good conversation in this part 2 of the book that talks about fear as something we use on, and if you don't believe me, it's totally okay, but spend some time reflecting on this, of how many of your decisions are based out of fear. And that fear is the reason for most of the reason we feel like we do, or do the things that we do, or say the things that we say. So please spend some time thinking about this. It's well worth it. So not forgiving so that we feel a sense of control over another person and even ourselves. This is a fear of not controlling. Forgiveness is the letting go, and the central theme of this course, and then moving towards what we are talking about is really joy, this depth dimension of true well-being or joy. I want to use that language. Letting go, paradoxically, is how we get there. It's not about doing more. it's about letting go. And again, to our capitalistic American way of thinking, it doesn't make sense. But it is paradoxical in how we get there. Okay, so then the last thing I wanted to talk about then is this notion of knowing what our limits are and it being a good teacher. This again gets to this topic that we're going to talk about in more detail next week in differentiating what our small self is relative to our bigger self, our true self, and that knowing that we operate from our small self most of the time, and our ego-driven self, the one that's always trying to protect ourselves there of this superior notion, this being separate, or this need for control, and how that's seems to be our default operating system, particularly in the first half of life. As they say, first half of life doesn't not necessarily age, but till we realize that there's something more beyond this way of living. That realization and moving out of that default operating system of our small self is suffering, and there is no other way to say it. It does feel like dying. It feels like I'm letting go of something that's really, really important to me, such as how I define myself, the titles that I give myself, the way I think about my positioning in the world. Letting go of that and not taking it so seriously is our way of moving in a new direction. And that moves us towards the third way. It moves us towards this depth dimension, this joy that we're talking about. And I don't want to, have this be confused that having advanced degrees is a bad thing, because it absolutely, obviously is not. We are here to do our part for the world, and sometimes that means being in a position that has advanced degrees, and with that comes more income, and with that comes other privilege. There is nothing inherently bad about that. It is how we perceive it and how we project that to the world, and if we can move beyond this small self and taking that part very seriously, so seriously that it becomes a part of our identity that influences others in a negative way, then we need to take a look at this. And this is what this chapter is about. It's the limits that we have are really good teachers, and realizing that we live most of our lives in the small self, and this individualism point of view is a really, really important step of just the realization that we're there, and this is where we live. We embrace the idea of the whole, but to do it in a way that seems to be all about me. So, care for the whole person still seems to be all about me in some ways. And, but, again, we're going to transition into this in week 4. It's a great conversation for our transition into week 4 of moving from small self to true self to big self. So this realization is important for our well-being, and it's getting to the heart of what hopefully this class is getting to with self-care. Okay? The true, honest, deep look at self-care, and that realizing that our world and our healthcare system are filled with contradictions. It's the point of this, is to come to a realization that, wow, things aren't as orderly as I thought they were, as what I'd hoped they would be. There is disorder and contradictions everywhere I look. And the third way would say, it's okay. This is the way it's always been. This is likely the way it always will be. Those contradictions are part of the experience. It's part of who we are in our humanness and the world in which we live in. That life is neither perfectly consistent and rational, nor a chaotic mess, as Rohr says. It's neither. Okay? The pattern of both existing at the same time seems to be here from the beginning, that there's both this side that seems to be the inconsistent, but also the okayness of it being there. The moving beyond this, looking at it's either has to be this or that, but that both and all are included. And so then we get to this point, and this is, I think, the point of this book, and really the book, I think, is this last piece here of seeing an acceptance of what is, and at the same time, knowing what is ours to do to make it better. So it's both an okayness of life as it is, and at the same time, having the notion that I know what is mine to do to alleviate suffering and to make things better for others. It's a both and. This is both being contemplative, the knowing part, and the action part, be contemplative in action, as is an Ignatian charism. That's what it means. It's knowing what is ours to do, and acceptance that it's a both and situation. It's not an either or. We're moving beyond this dualistic mind, okay? That we're coming into this sense of knowing, knowing what is ours to do and what we need to allow others to do because it is theirs to do. So here we can live in faith rather than in fear and a grandiose expectation. Okay? That seems to be the way, right? We have these grandiose expectations. If we can move beyond that, then I think we get into this third way. So wisdom then, as we wrap up this book, the wisdom pattern, the wisdom way of knowing, the wisdom is seeing the pattern as being more about synthesis than it is about analysis, that the pattern is more paradoxical than it is linear, and that the wisdom way of knowing this life is more about a dance rather than it is a march. So I think that's a good way to end, because if we can get there, this third way, then we can experience this greater depth, dimension of joy that we're trying to get to, this sense of well-being. So there we go. I was hoping this video would be less than 30 minutes. I almost made it. So I hope you've enjoyed the book and are able to take a great deal away from it. Allow yourself some time to reflect on your personal experiences and how you feel about some of this that has been written in the book. Allow some personal reflection, because I think that will help the material make more sense over time. This is not a sprint through this thing. This is a marathon. So go back and read the book later too, particularly maybe if you're highlighting some sections, just every once in a while, go back and read those. Well, I am certainly looking forward to reading your reflections, papers, and listening to and reading your discussions as well. I think we have had a great deal of fruitfulness so far in this course in that way. So keep up the good work, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.